Hi and welcome in 2026. For a new year I prepared new game-changing orchestral mockup tricks, this time dedicated for brass section. So without further ado, let's jump into the Cubase. First trick, epic brass. When you are writing a track where you expect an epic brass sound, relying only on the ensemble brass patch from your VST can be surprisingly difficult. And the reason for that is very simple. There is usually a lot happening in the background of such a track. So epic drums, epic impacts, risers and other sound effects. And the brass just doesn't cut through the mix the way you want it to. A really effective solution here is layering your ensemble brass patch with the braams. And for those who are not familiar with the braams, braams are those very low, usually low aggressive brass hits commonly used in the trial to add weight, power and sense of a scale to a cue. And they don't replace your brass section, they support it in the very good way when we talk about the trial sound. The best part for that is you don't really need to buy another library to create or to receive the braams sounds. Personally, I don't produce pure trailer music very often, but when I do, I like to use a free library available on a piano book. This is the website with the free VSTs created by the community, and the library is called World's Biggest Braams. You will find the link in the video description. So when we open the instrument itself, the layout, as you can see, is very simple. On the left, on this yellow, you can choose the scale in which the braams will be played, and on the right you have the purple side with a variety of different braams. So for example, so bearing in mind that this is really free VST library, the sound quality is surprisingly good in my humble opinion. Now let's listen to a short example. Firstly, without the brass, and after that with layering brass together with the brass ensemble. Second trick is all about getting the epic horns sound. And similar to the ensemble brass, a standard 4 horns patch can sometimes feel weak in comparison to other instruments in the orchestra, especially in the trial sound. So how do I deal with this? I layer 3 different patches of instruments. So when we open the epic horns brass, we have the 3 instances. First is a Cinematic Studio Brass 4 horns patch, and it gives me the main body and the harmony character to my sound. To add more attack at the beginning of each note, I use a marcato patch from a different library, and since Spitfire Audio released a free update to the Spitfire Symphony Orchestra, which is called Motif Brass, I use the Motif Horns patch. And the reason is really simple. It reacts to the articulation changes in the real time. So even when I'm using the legato patch on my main library, so Cinematic Studio Brass, I can still play shorter staccato-like notes without using the key switches. And finally, I also use the Cinematic Studio Brass solo horn to add more definition and the clarity to the instrument and to overall sound of my epic horns. Together these 3 layers create a horn sound which seems to be much bigger, more cinematic and more expressive, and also helps you to cut through the mix in these trailer sound themes. third trick might sound very obvious, but in practice, when I'm listening to orchestral mockups online, I feel it's not applied as often as it should be. And I'm talking about articulation changes. Firstly, let's listen of the short trumpet section from one of my older mockup, but using only one articulation, staccatissimo. As you can hear, because you are definitely familiar with the Hedwig's theme composed by John Williams, the result isn't convincing at all, and it doesn't even come close to the original score. So now let's try something different, and let's add the sforzato articulation exactly where it appears in the original score. And this might seem as a silly advice or a really small change, but from my perspective, in my humble opinion, it completely transforms the realism of the trumpets in this section. And when we go directly to the instrument, so Cinematic Studio Brass solo trumpet, you can see this mode wheel. And you can see that you can change the length of the short articulation almost in the real time by using the CC1 programming. So changing the length of the short notes with this patch is very simple, and you are not forced to use the key switches if you are not the key switch guy. But nevertheless, if you want and prefer more to use the key switches, it's also available. That's why in my mockups, whenever I'm using a short brass articulation, I always try to introduce variety instead of relying only on the one articulation. If you want to hear a practical example with a proper length of the composition, you can check my original composition, Unpredictable Journey. In my previous videos, I talked many times about how panning is important for our orchestral mockups, but when we come to the brass section, which usually sits behind the strings and behind the woodwinds, panning is not enough. We should create the illusion of depth of placement of our instruments. So let's quickly draw a simple diagram with two axes. Firstly, x-axis, which represents the stereo image of the mix. This is where the panning comes into play, distributing instruments from the left, center to the right. The y-axis, on the other hand, tells us whether an instrument feels closer to or farther away from our listener, and this is where reverb becomes crucial. So how do we use it? Firstly, we should lower down the volume of the individual instrument or the bass it's routed to. For example, if we lower the woodwinds by 2 dBs, which usually sits in the middle part of the depth section, then for the brass section we can lower it a bit more because brass sits regularly farther. So for example, 3 dBs. Next, we can send the signal to our chosen reverb, usually 2 reverbs, so convolution reverb to build the room and an algorithmic reverb to create the tail of our instrument. And here comes the trick. For a middle instrument and farther instrument, so the brass in this respect, we should apply pre-fader send of a reverb. But for the close instruments, we should implement post-fader. Because we are using a pre-fader send, the signal going into the reverb remains at 0 dBs, as if we hadn't lowered the channel volume at all. As a result, we ended up with 2 components of our instrument. First component, dry signal, which was lowered down by 3 dBs, and second one, the wet signal with the reverb, which remains unchanged, so has a 0 dB level. And this balance creates the illusion that the instrument is positioned farther away from the listener. Because let's imagine a simple situation. You are standing here, and here is your friend, and the distance between you and your friend is around 10 meters. What you are hearing more is the reverberance of the room in which you are located, rather than the direct signal between you and your friend. So this is exactly this situation. The direct signal, dry signal, was low down by 3 dBs, and the reverberance, so the wet signal, remains unchanged and stays at the level of 0 dBs. Now let's listen to the epic horn section from the previous example, firstly without pre-fader reverb send, and after that with this reverb. Fifth and final trick dedicated to EQing Brass section. So as the example, let's dive into two instruments, horns and trumpets. When we talk about horns, we should start from the high pass filter, usually between 80 to 100 Hz. It depends on the lower note of your instrument. So firstly, you should play the lower note and decide where to apply this high pass filter. After that, horns tends to have this muddiness, but the specific muddiness, honkiness, between 400 and 600 Hz. So in order to eliminate this honkiness, we can apply a little bit of the cut, something around 1 dB to 1.5 dB. What is also important, in order to leave the space for higher instruments, especially percussive higher instruments, so suspended cymbals, piatti, or higher snares, we can apply the low pass filter, something around 10K. But make sure you don't go too far, because when you take this curve around 8K, you can lose very important informants dedicated to the horns. And finally, to enhance the body of the instrument, especially when you play louder passages with the longer notes or with the higher velocity, when we talk about the short articulation, we can apply this boost around 2 to 3K. And the best way to apply this boost is to apply the dynamic EQ, so the EQ and the compression in one plugin. In this respect, this body will be triggered only where the volume reaches the dedicated threshold to it. The threshold is set by this curve, so you can take it up or down. Speaking of trumpets, the situation is almost the same with one exemption. So firstly, we apply the high pass filter, this time around 174, and also we apply the low pass filter, but the low pass filter should be taken rather to the right, so something around 12K. This is also important because the trumpet range is higher than the horns, so if we implement this low pass filter around 10K, we again can lose very important information dedicated to the trumpet. And finally, trumpets tend to have the harshness between 3 to 5K in this range. So, as the opposite to the horns, in this section we apply the cut, and cut also by using the dynamic EQ. So this cut will be triggered only when the volume of the instrument reach a dedicated threshold. Thank you very much for watching the video. As always, Cubase project file together with MIDI file will be available on my Buy Me a Coffee profile, so make sure you grab it here. Let me know in the comments whether this kind of information and trick are helpful for you. That way I will be able to prepare the content which will be tailor-suited to your needs. Thanks for watching and happy composing!